SpotlightOnPodcast.com/store is the place to go to get a Spotlight On collectible for the music and arts lover in your life, or maybe even yourself. Go to SpotlightOnPodcast.com/store today. Hello and welcome to Spotlight On, the companion podcast of thetonearm.com. Here we talk with the musicians, writers, and innovators shaping media, art, and culture. I'm your host, Lawrence Purrier. Today, the spotlight shines on clarinetist Glenn Dickson and electronic musician Bob Familiar. When a cutting-edge klezmer artist meets a former rock synthesist, you might expect creative tension. Instead, Glenn and Bob found something else entirely. A shared language that turns clarinet and electronics into the most unlikely but inspired pairing. Their new album, All the Light of Our Sphere, layers acoustic clarinet with synthesizers and loop devices to create what they describe as orchestral ambient music. The tracks were recorded live with no overdubs, no click tracks, just two musicians finding their way through inspired improvisations. Glenn brings decades of experience from klezmer to microtonal jazz, while Bob's electronic landscapes draw from science fiction and years in Boston's rock scene. Together, they're creating something that sits between Brian Eno and Eastern European folk traditions. And now, Glenn Dickson and Bob Familiar. My first question is for you, Glenn. I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about the origin story of the collaboration, specifically about the night that you and Bob met and what it was about what he was doing that caught your attention.
Okay. Well, we met at an electronic music concert. We were both on the bill. I played earlier, and then I heard him play, and I would say what he was doing was developing and moving forward, as opposed to a lot of electronic things, which are sort of stagnant in a certain way. He was using loop processors that evolve rather than just stay in one place, which is what I do also. I don't just make a loop and stick on it. I'm constantly evolving, fading loops out, bringing new material in. So the music evolves and has a story going on, as Bob likes to say. It goes from one place to the next. After he played and we were hanging out, Bob came over and said, we're doing similar sorts of things. Why don't we get together and play? So that's what we did. I said, yeah, sounds good.
Yeah, it was really exciting to hear another musician who felt like was living in the same world I was living in. It was like, okay, there's someone that is seeing the world through the same lens and approaching music through the same lens. And we were of different approaches. I was using synthesizer, Glenn's using a clarinet, yet we were using loopers in a very similar way, creating these evolving textures and landscapes and then playing over top of that. And it just seemed like it was a ripe ground for just, digging in and seeing what we could do together and how that would sound. And so, yeah, we just started on a path of doing lots of jams together.
How soon after that initial meeting and admiration of what each other were doing, how long did it take you guys to actually get together and get in a room and start playing together?
It wasn't long, just a few weeks.
Yeah, it wasn't long.
Yeah, we played together, I think it was April of 2024. And I think easily by May or June, we were in my home studio here and we just set up, started rolling, recording after getting levels and we just started playing and we ended up playing for like 2 hours the first time, recorded everything. I went back and kind of pulled some parts out and shared it with Glenn, said, hey, this is sounding pretty good. We made another scheduled get together. We got together 4 times altogether. We had about 8 hours of material after all of that, all improvised. But at the end, what was really cool was to find these moments that just felt like compositions. And I was like, wow, this is really cool the way that this evolved. If we start here and we end here, as Glenn pointed out, I said, there's a story arc right there. There's a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end, beautiful melodies, beautiful changes. And And yeah, so we concurred and ended up with about 9 tracks at the end of it. Yeah.
Beautiful. You know, you both have already said a couple of things that foreshadow some of the themes or topics I want to explore. The first of which was, Glenn, you mentioned the forward momentum and the lack of stagnation that you heard in Bob's playing, and as something that resonated for you or that appealed to you, as opposed to some other ambient or drone music that can be, you know, a bit, I'll use the word stagnant, even though it's sort of loaded in a negative way. And I don't think any of, you know, I certainly, I like all the meat in the human stew, all of the different types. But I'm
Yeah.
curious specifically. I like to get into process a little bit, and you mentioned the looping and the use of loops. Do you mind lifting the hood a little bit and talking about when you're creating the loops to keep the music moving? Are you doing that in real time? Are you triggering things that you've pre-made? Could you just talk a little bit about how you enforce the movement?
Yeah, well, for starters, I don't use an actual looper. I use a delay, which yeah, the technical difference is a delay, and I use long delays. So it sort of acts like a looper, but you can fade things out and bring new things in. Yes, everything we do, and I can speak for Bob too, we input things live in the spur of the moment, in the moment, and deal with it in live for our performances. And for these sessions that we did, there was nothing pre-recorded, nothing added afterwards, actually. So what you hear is what we did in the moment.
Wow.
Because, I've been doing this for a while, and I have a pretty good sense of what I want to have happen and how to make things happen and how to correct things or change things. So it comes from experience.
Yeah. So in that case, just to follow up on that, is it too heavy-handed to say that the delay unit and any other sort of gear that you might be employing in the moment, you have to have proficiency with those as instruments as well, it would seem?
Oh yeah, it's definitely, and Bob's are more complicated than mine, but yeah, you have to be used to working with it and then the spur of the moment, because you don't want to have to sit there and think, okay, what do I do now?
Yeah.
Or it's like, bam, bam, yeah, and you're playing and you're doing it while you're playing and making music out of it. So yeah, it's definitely an extension of the instrument to a large degree.
Bob, the other element that came up in the opening comments from you both was the idea of narrative and structure. And I think one of you said beginning, middle, and end to how the pieces wound up feeling and coming across as compositions. Will you tell me a little bit about the literary inspirations and sources that you tap into for creating electronic and improvised and story-based music?
Sure. So yeah, I mean, for myself, I read a lot, so pretty much reading something every day. Pretty much a hardcore science fiction fan, so reading a lot of science fiction or things which are just on the boundary of more traditional literature. I enjoy that,
Mm.
and that inspires me just to, as I'm improvising, to take some chances and try to evolve my own playing so that it has some structure but yet changes over time. Technically that means as Glenn was talking about, his looping, my looping, none of this is synchronized. So I'm using loopers that are unsynchronized. So in the same way, it's as I input ideas into these, now that's another musician that I'm in essence that I'm working with. And so it's almost like another character in the story. So now as I'm working against that, it's okay, what's a motif now that might blend nicely with that and find some space to fit that in. And all of a sudden, they're just sort of, these ideas are floating over one another. As Glenn and I were playing together, what really thrilled me is this Glenn is such an amazing player. His melodies that when, he gets into structuring his melodies are so beautiful. So, we're both creating these underlying motifs that are layering and floating over one another, and they're not necessarily in time. So that changes itself, or that foundation is shifting. And Glenn is playing these beautiful melodies over top. And from the story perspective, that's where my ear saw the arc. I really in the mixing, in the effort of mixing this, it was tapping into Glenn's own playing and just the way he evolves his melodies. And that's where, for me, it's like, wow, that's where this whole story arc is really coming from. For me, the way I listen I was listening to it. So
Glenn, are you thinking narratively as you're constructing an improvisation or one of these pieces?
I was just thinking about that. I'm thinking, okay, I just did this. What's going to sound good next, basically? Or,
and he's very good at it. You see, so he chooses wisely.
yeah, I'm just, I'm going along and thinking, yeah, here's where I am. Where do I want to go from here? And when I listen back, I'm sort of surprised that it sounds coherent, because I'm not, you sort of get into a zone where you're just playing and making things happen, but you're not necessarily totally conscious of it. Although part of my brain is like, okay, is this going on too long, or should I bring something in new here or whatever? There's a lot of things going on in your mind while you're playing something like this. That's why it's just important to have like control over your technology, so it's intuitive, so you don't have to put another part of your brain into the technology or anything, that you're just sort of like making choices and making them happen sort of automatically, because you know how it all works,
And I was just going to add, it just takes a tremendous amount of patience, I think, on both our parts. Be listening. I'm listening to what Glenn is doing. I'm listening to what I've just generated. So now all of that activity is going on, and it's being really patient as that evolves, just to not just to start piling on top. It's like, there'll be many times when we're performing live now that we're out doing that, and I might not do anything for a minute, minute and a half, 2 minutes, because everything is there. It's like, if I added anything, it would ruin it. It's like, no, I'm going to let this ride. And then when that starts to settle down, then, now bring in a new idea. So that patience, I think, is really, on both our parts, is critical to this kind of music.
When you're dealing with things that aren't synchronized, and also, Bob's loops are generating new, algorithmically evolving on their own. So to a certain extent, you have to always listen to how things are evolving with the loops and the ideas that are already happening, and be careful not to overload the system, or just be really aware at the same time of everything that's happening.
The rather obvious juxtaposition between the electric and acoustic elements here, the technology and or the digital and the analog, or however you want to characterize the fact that we have a synthesizer wizard with a clarinet wizard together. I love the meeting point of structure and improvisation, as well as the electroacoustic blending. That it's some real, it's some of the most interesting creative music right now, I think, is blending all of those things. Something I'm really curious about, the way you've introduced what I would think of as some constraints into your process, in terms of, especially the album recording process of, you mentioned no overdubs, and my understanding is there weren't things like timers or click tracks, or things that I don't necessarily think of as, they're not cheats or shortcuts or anything like that, but they're choices. And they sort of create a certain box or environment for you. Something that comes up repeatedly as a theme when I speak with artists is that if you don't have any constraints, it's almost impossible, right? Because there's too much, it's overload. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about maybe perhaps the philosophical or practical considerations that go into some of the constraints you chose to, or that you choose to impose on your process?
For me, playing a clarinet is a big choice, and it allows a certain expression, at least for me, having played it a long time. But also at least on my end, the electronics are very simple. Everything I'm doing is pretty simple, and I've explored it fairly deeply. So I feel totally comfortable in that. And it's a limitation. I sort of limit myself to stuff that I can really understand what I'm doing. And if it gets too out there, technology wise or anything, I want to keep it totally within. I can control what's going on, I guess. I don't know. What do you have to say about that, Bob?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned a lot of the choices we made. So for myself, I've got a lot of instruments. I have learned throughout the years of doing this that if I try to go, I'm going to use all 5 of these are my favorite, I'm going to do all, then nothing gets done. So just paring it down, saying, playing with Glenn, what I envisioned was what would work well with the clarinet was a Rhodes piano. So that was one choice that went through its own looper and its own set of effects. And you can hear a lot of that anywhere there's the Rhodes being used on the album. It kind of is, it's a recognizable, right? So there's that. But the other instrument is the Expressive E Osmose. So this is a new kind of instrument from Expressive E, where they've introduced technology into the keys themselves, which allow the keyboard player to be very expressive. So there's multiple stages as you press the key down that are programmable. The key can move left and right, and that can be programmable. So doing things like having a sound that might start off clicky, but then speed up, and I can control the speeding up and the slowing down, or even more simply, just the brightness on a pad and bring that brightness in and bring it out. But I'm controlling that through the way I'm playing rather than turning knobs or post-processing or anything like that. So it allows me to be expressive in the moment. The Rhodes allowed me to be expressive in the moment. And those were sort of the constraints. I said, I don't want anything synchronized. We're not using a drum machine. We're not synchronizing the 3 loopers that we were using. We're just going to let them float free and allow ourselves to be expressive through the instruments that we're playing. So Glenn, incredibly expressive on the clarinet, and I was trying to stay up with him on that through my instruments, being expressive and blending in as well as I could.
Oh, one more just relation. It sounds like when you say, okay, I'm not going to use a click track, opens things up and maybe, too much. But for us, it's part of sort of takes a limit off, which doesn't need to be there, or that limit boxes you in to a certain extent. So by not having everything synchronized, things float around, and it gives them more of an atmospheric feel, and it removes the boxes sort of that a constant click or whatever creates.
And that's hard. That makes actually the playing and the performing harder. You have to be, like I said, very patient, and you have to be listening really well so that you're not clashing, that you are introducing ideas gently and purposefully as the moment arrives when, okay, now's the time to bring this in. You have to work hard at that when you're not using the tools in the studio that allow you to say, oh, you know what, we can go back, I can just clip that out and we can overdub a new part right in there. That's a great thing to be able to do, and I've done a lot of that in the studio. But for this, it just felt like let's challenge ourselves in this way and see what happens.
Can you tell me a little bit about how these pieces go from studio performances to translating into a live setting? Have you begun performing yet, or what is the live presentation idea around these?
Yeah, we've done some performances. Yeah, we just played a couple nights ago, Saturday night. We're still working that out, I suppose, to a certain degree, but for the most part, we just go in and we sort of set up key structures for ourselves, and then everything else is sort of the same way that we did it in the studio. In the studio, we didn't talk at all before we started playing, except let's play in this mode or this key. But when we're playing live, we'll have a structure going from one key to the next if we're going to be playing for an extended period, so that so it doesn't get monotonous key-wise or anything. But we did our album release concert the other night, and Bob took some of the Rhodes tracks. We'd never done this before, but he separated out the Rhodes tracks and played them, and we played over some of those for the album release, just to sort of give that flavor of what the album was. But I don't know if we'll continue doing that. We haven't talked about it, but
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking, because the Rhodes is just really heavy,
to carry, yeah.
Lawrence. I just, I'll hurt myself if I try to lift it and carry it anywhere. So I say, okay, if we wanted to sort of create a flavor of, let's say, the opening track or one of the other tracks that had the Rhodes on it, if I just extract that one track and have it as a backing track, which is easily done with a laptop in the mix, and take the audio out from that. Now that's playing, and Glenn and I then just improvise to that. So we're not really recreating that original piece of music that's on the record, but we're just going to use that motif and we'll improvise over top of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we do really well if we just go, okay, let's go through these 5 key centers for the next 40 minutes and we'll sit down and go do that. So that actually a lot of times feels a lot more comfortable than trying to play to the backing track. So, but when I was trying to figure out, people are starting to like a particular, piece off the record there, that maybe they want to hear us do that, but we don't have to do that. But it was a thought.
Yeah.
It's an everything's an experiment.
Yeah.
Every time we get together.
It's really interesting because it sounds like you use in that instance, you use the backing track almost the way a jazz group might use a theme and as like the basis for the exploration. But if you go see them 5 nights in a row, you're getting 5 variations on that theme.
Exactly.
Yeah, the Rhodes parts on the piano on the album are foundational. I guess the equivalent of a chord change or a vamp or a that you hear jazz tune. So it sort of gives something to play over that's reminiscent exactly of what we did. But yeah, we're doing something different. It'd be interesting to learn some of the melodies I actually played, but I haven't done that.
Right.
Yeah, I'm always curious about that when the process that you described about going into the studio, recording longer sessions, and then finding the compositions, if you will, within those. I'm always curious as to whether or not artists that record that way ever run the recordings through a sheet music generator, a transcription program or something to see to generate a score, basically, to see what that would look like. It's fascinating that, because you speak about them as, like after the fact compositions, and we know that improvisation's composition in the moment, but it'd be so interesting to see that and then to try to perform it.
Yeah. I mean, some of the melodies that I played are pretty clear cut, and it'd be possible to do some of those melodies. It'd be interesting. Well, one thing that just occurred to me as we were talking about this is, Miles Davis used the same process, like when he was back doing In a Silent Way, Bitches Brew in there. They were just jamming in the studio, and then they cut it all up and made tunes out of them, So it's sort of a similar process, really.
We'll be back with more Spotlight On and Glenn Dickson and Bob Familiar right after this break.
After listening to this episode, head to thetonarm.com, our online journal covering unexpected music and culture. This week on The Tone Arm, improvising classical guitarist Kim Perlak describes how being in the moment has become both her greatest challenge and her greatest gift. Composer Jamie Hamilton discusses his project Versionland, which explores paranoia inspired by a mysterious phenomenon known as the hum. And mathematician turned musician Stephen Thalen draws upon both his disciplines for his latest album, Worlds in Collision. You'll find all this and more on The Tone Arm. And while you're there, be sure to subscribe to our email newsletter. That's thetonarm.com. The Tone Arm, putting a needle on the cultural wax.
And now, back to Spotlight On. When you talked about having the sort of set of chords or modes that you might talk about in advance, making sure that gives your presentation some variation for when you're performing live. To double click a little bit on that, if it's let's just use your example, it's a 40-minute set. Do you say, okay, these are the 5 modes we're going to play in, and we're going to change every 8 minutes? Or how do you signal? Like, are you, as improvisers, are you using cues and?
No. we're just following each other's leads and listening to the music and we're both sort of independently saying, okay, now's about time, or it feels like we're winding that up. Let's go into something else. I don't know. We might look over at each other just to make sure that we're on the same page.
Yeah. So basically, if somebody feels that musical idea has run its course or they're ready for a transition, they sort of work towards the transition and then you move along. Yeah.
And we typically choose chord centers that are related to one another. We might go through almost like a circle of fifths, something like that, and decide, well, this one's major, this one's minor, this one's Lydian, we'll do this one as a Dorian, whatever, we'll just figure out modes and key centers. And so a lot of times it's, as Glenn likes to say, we'll just add a sharp, we're just adding a sharp. So that's the transition. As soon as you hear that it's like, okay, now's the time.
For me, I mean, even if we say X key, C major, that to me is just a group of notes, and it may or may not be C major. It may be just a mode out of that set of notes. It's more of a set of notes, and I don't think really. Most of the time, I'm not even aware of what key or where the tonic is, except for intuitively. I'm just going towards a certain note, not thinking intellectually in that way.
So it's more of a framework, to a guiding principle to ensure some variation.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. To just change our sets of notes periodically to, you're that's one of the things about ambient music, if you stay on the same thing for a long time, it can get boring. Or some people would say it's more meditative, but I like the feeling of moving from one key to the next, varying it that way. Paul Simon liked to say he would order his albums by the keys, not by what song, what song went from one to the next. It was more like how the keys of the songs progressed. It's sort of like, you want to hear, it sort of gives you a feeling of movement when you do that.
Yeah. Tell me about the title track. So All the Light of Our Sphere is both the album title and a track on the album. And if there's something about that particular piece, why is it the title track, I guess, is one way to ask you. But what I really mean beneath that is it somehow representative or emblematic of what you guys were after or what you achieved? And if it's not that deep, that's fine. But I'm curious as to whether that particular track means something in relation to the overall project.
I think what's important to know is probably first is how the names of the tracks were chosen. So I'll let Glenn tell that story.
Okay, so Bob and I both do that, or have done this before. As it turns out, I look through poetry books and pull out lines that I like or little phrases.
Oh, I love this. For
this, and so I just pulled off a translation of the Inferno, Dante, and just sort of was going through it and pulling out little phrases that I liked, and I made a whole list of phrases. Then I listened to the tracks and said, oh, this one goes with this one, and this goes with this feels like this. So I just sort of matched them up that way because I liked the sound of the words, and I thought the feeling that they had matched the sound of the music. And as far as using that one for the title track, I just liked that expression. I sort of the luminous quality of it. It sort of goes with the cover photo on the CD. It just felt like the right phrase to sum up what we were doing. That's how it's not that particular track summed up musically what we're doing, perhaps, but it's just like I wanted to have a title that sort of expressed what the album was about.
I think one of the most interesting topics that I get to explore with a lot of artists who work in improvised realms and instrumental realms is this idea of the things you guys have both touched on, the narrative arc in music that does not have lyrics and conveying narrative in instrumental music, as well as I love the titling process. It's so fascinating the way different artists answer the questions around how they approach titles. And, the range could be on one side, like I've had artists say to me, I don't even know the titles. Like somebody else titled it, or I let one of the band members or the producer or the engineer had an idea and we just that sounds fine. Fascinating, right? And then other people, like, it's part of a very specific narrative or conceptual or thematic presentation. And I love the room and the space for all those ideas.
To me, the titles, especially on an instrumental track, just give the listener a direction or a feeling, just that's helpful maybe for a listener to have. Yeah, so they're not necessary. Obviously, we didn't talk about the titles before we just played, and so, but it's also like when we play a lot of electronic music concerts have visual component to them, where with the visual artist doing moving visuals while you're playing, and that's not necessary either, but it helps some listeners to focus in on the music or to create a vibe for them that helps them into the journey, so to speak.
Now, I thought that the titles that Glenn chose were just perfect because the music itself is very poetic, and having the titles, drawn from great poetry, I was all in on that. So I just went, okay.
That's great. Yeah. I've just a couple of last questions for you, and Bob, I'm gonna go to you for this one. I'm really curious about some of the broader work you do in the electronic music and sort of world of synthesizers and electronic music. It's such a deep vein, and I think with maybe electronic music in general having a longer history or a richer history than I think maybe some people realize. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about tradition there, right? Because we talk about tradition so much with jazz artists and creative music artists and where they fit and where they came from and how they see themselves and where any individual project might even fit in a tradition. I wonder if you think that way or if you're cognizant of the strands and what strand you might fit in and what this might fit in the universe of electronic music.
What drew me to electronic music is I love that it seemed to bridge engineering and art. And I always liked being in that space. So I went to school as an engineer, but I've been a musician my whole life. So I was just drawn to that nexus. And when electronic musicians get together, we're talking as much about our gear and the who manufactured it and what technology is used and the firmware and the knobs came from this supplier and the circuits from this supplier and based on Bob Moog's design, or this is a Buchla design, it's his ARP, whatever it is. So the personalities that the engineers who created the instruments are the rock stars, I think, in that world as much as the people who even play the instruments. So that's kind of for me, that's the tradition, that's the legacy of it. And coming up from that, then you get drawn into not only commercial music or jazz where these instruments were being used and actually starting to show up, back in the 70s and the 80s when I was becoming aware of that world and participating in it. You're also, because of the engineering aspect of it, you find yourself drawn into the very experimental side that is so critical, I think, to electronic music and the influence it has had from the classical composers who adopted electronics in the 40s, 50s, and 60s and started to compose pieces just for electronics. You still see that today where there's, this bridging of experimental music, even noise music, ambient, and over into commercial, and EDM and a lot of pop music, which uses a lot of technology these days. So all of the artists that are in that space, it's interesting, they all get together. And so one of the things I do is I sit on the board of the New England Synthesizer Festival, which we run twice a year here in New England. And we bring together the engineers and the musicians for a day of performances, what we call a synth petting zoo. So everyone gets to check out all the different gear. We have vendors come in that anywhere from folks who manufacture their own guitar pedals to synthesizer manufacturers. The ARP Foundation is usually always there. Dina Perlman, who runs that. And there's lectures being given by professors from Berkeley or musicians who are experts or engineers who are experts in certain areas. And it's just an exciting space to be in. And the performances will range from something that's more like EDM and dance music. And the next thing might be a noise artist. And the next thing after that will be ambient. And it's just really cool to see the range of artists and what they're sharing with each other. And there's no walls between all these folks, because what binds them together is the equipment and the history of that equipment and the engineering aspect of that equipment.
Before I turn to Glenn for my final question, Bob, would you be willing to maybe name a couple of artists that, from the field of electronic music, as broadly defined as possible, that you have found over the years particularly inspiring or maybe even just interesting?
I would be remiss if I didn't mention Brian Eno. Certainly is interesting. When I was at Berkeley in the late 70s, I don't know if I was the only one, but I felt kind of alone that I was the one listening to Brian Eno and everyone else was listening to Asia and Steely Dan. And I love that, but I was like, but I'm going to put on Before and After Science, because I just thought that, or Another Green World, that to me, that was exciting. And that was sort of the direction I wanted to go in. And of course, the work he did with Robert Fripp, and I was always a fan of King Crimson. And interesting, the looping machine I use is based on the work that Eno and Fripp did together back then when they were, connecting tape machines together. So that is certainly in my roots. And I would say, gosh, there's so many. These days, Nils Frahm sticks out to me. I love Nils Frahm. I love, Tangerine Dream, Kraftwerk. I mean, the list is long, Lawrence. It's just so long. There's so many influential players. Herbie Hancock, even. They were all influential because what they demonstrated is, look, we're all using all this similar equipment, but look at all the different creative things we can do with it. And that's what drew me to the electronic instruments, was just the vast array of possibilities.
Thank you for that, because that really dovetails into the question I wanted to ask Glenn around the idea of, listening to Bob, you get a sense for the versatility of those instruments, right? They show up in so many contexts: rock, pop, EDM, experimental music, modern classical, jazz. It's so fascinating how the artists who use those instruments have been able to adapt them in so many contexts. But you're doing that as well, right? With a instrument that comes from its own very specific traditions. Yet the clarinet is, I love the sound of the clarinet. It's even surpassed the tenor saxophone for me as a sound I could listen to endlessly. And I'm very curious to hear your perspective about, where do you see the clarinet and this hybrid approach you've explored with this music? Where do you see it heading, either for yourself? Is this a vein for you to tap into and do more work in? Or for the clarinet more broadly? Did you always know the clarinet was this versatile of an instrument?
From the time I was in college, probably, and just started hearing a lot. I went to New England Conservatory and heard a lot the clarinet being used in a lot of different ways there. Just being exposed to all the klezmer and the Balkan and the Turkish, and then also early jazz, their fluidity of their pitch and tone that they were using. I started to realize just the clarinet was capable of a lot of things also. And, there's a lot of people using electronics on the clarinet now and a lot of composers composing. So I'm just doing my own thing. But really, to tell the truth, I came out of Robert Fripp because when I was a kid, I went to hear him play when he was doing his Frippertronics tours with the 2 tape decks and everything. And that just blew my mind. And as soon as, but it wasn't for like another 20 years that the equipment sort of evolved that I could do it on a clarinet, similar sort of thing, using just a pedal and a pickup mic. And as soon as that happened, I was like, yeah, I'm going to do this, because it was a formative experience for me, hearing Robert Fripp and what just the musical technique. So it didn't matter that it was a guitar. As far as evolving, and I'm exploring, now I'm into this more, or I've been doing that for a long time, but I'm starting to explore I'll put it this way. I've always been I love the clarinet sound too, and I didn't want to really mess with the sound that much, but I'm starting to mess with the sound a little bit now, using distortion pedals and guitar pedals on it a little more, just to for musical variation and for certain situations. If you layer too many clarinets on top of each other, it's hard to penetrate through that with a melody. So, I'll change the sound for the melody, that sort of thing. So I'm starting to use different techniques and bring in different things, exploring the whole world out there of electronics to see what makes sense. I try to make it something that makes sense to me, or that I imagine, and or not just sort of randomly doing stuff,
Thank you so much, Glenn Dickson and Bob Familiar. And as always, thank you for listening to Spotlight On. Spotlight On is executive produced and hosted by me, Lawrence Purrier. We're produced and marketed by Michael Donaldson. Editing and sound design is by Terry Grant. Our theme music is by Q-Burn's Abstract Message. Thank you so much for supporting our work. Please rate and review us wherever you listen to podcasts. And then visit us online at spotlightonpodcast.com. There you can explore the free episode archive. For more interviews and writings from me and a diverse array of contributors, check out thetonarm.com. Thanks for listening, be safe, and stay in touch.